Welcome to Directionally Correct, a business podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Craig Starbuck, co-founder and CEO of OrgAcuity.
Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization.
Trials and tribulations of what I just went through.
Yeah. Well, Craig, when you travel for work, do you travel opulently? Are you staying in the equivalent of a sales hotel, or are you staying in the HR hotel?
So it depends on where I'm traveling. I go for convenience. So whatever is most convenient and allows me to get a good night's rest to the extent I get sufficient sleep, which is a rarity for me. But yeah, I middle of the road, I would say, is my style.
Like the difference between like a 4-star and 5-star, I think it's just like amenities, right? It's like we have a massage or, the spa, that sort of stuff. Like I can't differentiate the rooms, but I can do like a 3 to 4, definitely.
Honestly, the difference between a 4 and a 5-star to me is
purely theoretical. Cole's having a little bit of audio issues, but I think he may be onto something, right? Like there's difference between like a 2-star. The 2-star experience to the 3-star is definitely vast.
Yeah, I think we're splitting hairs talking about 4 versus 5 stars. Like, I think if it's at least 4 stars, it's good enough for me.
It's so good to see you again, man. Like, I tell people, like, you got the total package. You got the killer name, Craig Starbuck. Like, if someone writing a movie and they put Craig Starbuck as like the lead character, the director would come back like, no, that doesn't work. You got the great looks. I mean, great game recognizes game. You know how it does.
Game recognizes game. Wow. All right. We're really going here today. Well, Craig, it is fantastic to have you back. For those of you who haven't listened before, check out episode 28 of the podcast where we had Craig on for the first time. But you're joining us today in a slightly different capacity, which I'm really excited about, as the co-founder and CEO of OrgAcuity. And so I appreciate you guys for being a part of our HR Tech Voices series. But can you tell us a little bit about OrgAcuity and what it is and kind of what problem it's solving and why you got involved or why you started the company?
Yeah, and good to be back with you guys. Like it's hard to believe it's been like almost a couple of years. Like back when like ChatGPT was like this thing that no one even knew about. Kind of embarrassing to think about my answers to your questions about like, how do you think ChatGPT will change the name of the game 2 years ago, and look where we are now. But yeah, great to be back with you guys. Maybe I'll start with kind of the origin story of like what led up to the formation of OrgAcuity before explaining what it is. For me, employee voice has always been something I've been very intrigued by, even before getting into like the HR realm, the people analytics realm, before I knew that it was, called employee voice in the literature. But just this decision about whether or not somebody speaks up in an organization in a pro-social way. Like, do they contribute their ideas and their suggestions for change? Do they flag like risks and perceived problems before, a project goes off track and costs the organization a lot of money? I was very intrigued by this because what I saw early in my career, you guys know this, I started in engineering roles before I moved into HR. What I saw was kind of this melting pot of like dissimilar cultures. You've got like some national cultural norms coming into play. You've got individual differences. You've got team dynamics. But all of these things together really influence the degree to which a team could be successful. And it really hinged on the leader to navigate those things. You had things like, power distance orientation, coming from certain cultures where it was kind of accepted that power was unequally distributed in organizations. But then you have like Western society where it's like no, like I should have a voice. You should like consult me before making this decision that's going to like impact my experience in the organization. And, I just saw this like repeated pattern of organizations spend so much time and money recruiting the best and brightest people. But if once they're there, the conditions are not such that they can contribute their voice, their ideas, their perspectives, their expertise, then it's like an exercise in futility on the talent acquisition side, because we're not able to fully leverage their talent and their expertise. I really was intrigued by this. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on employee voice, specifically leader-directed voice, and looking at all the various individual and team level factors like psychological safety and the relationship with a manager and all these things that influence one's decision about, do they speak up or do they withhold the information and resort to silence? And so that's set in motion about a decade now of being deeply immersed in what's known as employee listening in organizations, but all about how do we capture the voice of people? For all the talk about like a feedback culture, we want people to like just share open and honest feedbacks. Many people are not willing to do that, right? Whether that's like non-confrontational, or they don't think it's going to go over well. They think that it's risky. There's going to be like negative consequences if they speak up and they share what they really think about their boss or their, the situation. And so, even today in the world of AI, organizations need some mechanism for elevating the voice of every person in the organization, because they're just not willing and able to do it in most cases face to face, in a very candid way. So that was kind of the inspiration behind getting into employee listening. And once I did, my first role leading people analytics, which I've done at 7 companies now, my first role leading people analytics, I saw that employee listening was owned by HR compliance. And they were very clear, like they didn't want it. There was just like no one else to like drive the work forward. And I took a look at like what we were getting, and it was like Excel dumps from a vendor with like, verbatim comments and like favorability distributions, like very rudimentary stuff. We were paying a lot of money for that. And I said, like, we can and should do better. So like, give this to me. I'd like to own employee listening. I'd like to start incorporating this into the broader people analytics roadmap, because I think this could be really impactful. And so went out to RFP, got a new vendor. And I remember the first model I ever built within HR was to understand drivers of attrition. I was working for a brokerage firm at the time. We had a pretty big attrition problem on the brokerage side. And those were the people bringing in the assets. Those were the people like really bringing in the revenue for the company. So it was a big problem. And I started off looking at like HRIS attributes, like, the person's tenure and the person's location and their job. And there was like no signal, no signal whatsoever. I'm like, well, this is unfortunate. Like, I'm not going to be able to help with this solution based on these features. But we had like all this great listening data. So I started to incorporate that, like what are individuals' perceptions about career advancement opportunities? What are their perceptions about their manager? Do they see a future here? Is the culture compatible with what they thought coming in? And there was a lot of signal, a lot of predictive power in that data. I mean, as it turns out, if you ask someone if they plan to be here in 2 years and they say no, they typically leave at higher rates. Like, shocker, right? It's like it's not super complicated, but
that's one of the variables that we have in IO, right? It's about a 0.5 correlation, depending on the time of year and the job market and everything else. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So that was like the aha moment for me of like, this is probably some of the most important data if we want to understand organizational phenomena and we want to look at leading indicators of actual behavioral outcomes. Like, I've got to get my arms around this attitudinal, perceptive, sentiment, intentional data, because it seems highly predictive. So that's a little bit about the journey. Implicit in OrgAcuity being founded is that there was a perceived gap in the market, right? And I've leveraged a lot of the vendors, and I found myself like increasingly doing things outside the platform that leaders were finding value in. And I thought there's got to be a way that we can like bring all of this together and make it easier for organizations. And I'll get into more specifics, like I'm sure throughout this conversation around, the active organizational network analysis component, which is kind of a new flavor, network-based listening. But I also started thinking about, there's a lot of organizations in the world, small to mid-market, shall we say, that don't have access to this. And whether that's because they don't have the financial capital needed to like build an internal function, or they don't have the budget to acquire like, expensive enterprise SaaS. But every organization can benefit from this. Every organization has talent related challenges, right? People are an organization's most expensive and most important asset. And, I've had some opportunities throughout my career to work under really great leaders and really great environments. And I've also had a couple of opportunities to work in environments that, shall we say, were less than favorable, right? Very toxic places that I did not want to be. And in these environments, I saw really great people leaving in droves, like really talented people whose contributions were not known. They were not understood. They might be like unsuspecting people that are like the sole reason that HR talks to finance. And, people don't tend to think of that person as like a key influencer, like being like really critical to the organization's success. But in fact, they were. But they were heavily leveraged. They were burnout. They were overloaded. They were leaving. And I thought there's got to be a way to elevate this to those who can authorize action, those who can authorize change. But there's a lot of organizations that just don't have the same level of access to data-driven insights about people. And so it was at that time that I started building OrgAcuity on the side. My business partner and I, he's an IO psychologist by training in academia, and he's since pivoted to more of like an infrastructure-oriented role. But he and I founded OrgAcuity, simply put, to make this insight accessible to all organizations. And that means that the product itself has to be simple. Like, we don't use technical vernacular. We don't characterize it as like O&A. But also the price point has to be accessible. It's got to be something that's within reach for smaller organizations that can't afford the larger enterprise players. And so as I looked at that, I said, it's going to be very difficult to build this. It's going to take a long time to build this. But if I can bootstrap this, if he and I can bootstrap this, and we can use our own funds for the additional resourcing that will be required, and we raise no money, we can offer this at a more competitive price point. And we spent about 4 years doing that. We started with an early customer. There were 8,000 people, which is not exactly our ICP, but we got their feedback. It was basically like a services business in the beginning. We were their like people analytics and employee listening capability. And over the years, we've evolved a lot by taking into account their feedback, seeing what resonates, what doesn't. And, fast forward to today, we've got a product that will compete with the best of these listening providers, and it does some things that others are not doing. And because we own 100% of the company, we are in a very fortunate situation to have the product where it is without being beholden to, shall we say, investors that are focused on one thing, their 100x return, right? And I think there will come a time when we want to raise funding because we're doing ourselves a disservice by not having that outside funding and pouring fuel on what already is working. But that's a little bit about kind of the journey getting here, and a little bit about why we chose to form OrgAcuity.
I mean, there's so much to dig into there. Like, as far as like, the network dynamics, I can't wait to get into that. But like, well, what does it look like from the customer standpoint? Like, is it totally a consultative model, or do you like deliver them a platform for them to like just have a continuous listening system? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, great question. So we're a B2B SaaS player through and through. We don't do anything with the professional services side, but we have an ecosystem of partner organizations that do only that. So we're very clear. We're in the SaaS space. We're a tech company. I have a day job, so I can't be working with customers on like implementation steps and all the stuff that comes along with that. But we've got some great partner organizations that help us there and service the customers. So we're fully focused on the product. So yes, it's a platform. They log into the UI. We've got a collection of like pages and views that are based on their data, all the worker data that we're capturing from their HRIS, business outcome data that they're sending to us to help, quantify the effect that, experiences and engagement, things like this are having on business outcomes. I think that's a real, difficult thing to do for most organizations. We talk a lot about it. We know that it's something that needs to happen. but few organizations are actually doing that well. And I think vendors can make it easier. And then, of course, all of the survey data that we're capturing for, pulse surveys and your annual, biannual engagement survey, whatever it might be. But that platform is curating all of those data assets together. And then our partner organizations on the consulting services side, they're guiding employers through kind of, what to measure and survey design best practices and how do you take action on this and how you move the needle to really drive behavioral change.
Yeah, Craig, I know you support, all size of businesses, right? But I think you're focused more on the kind of businesses that really couldn't have this type of product traditionally. What have you found that they care the most about? Like, what are their key pain points and how are you guys helping solve those?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, it really varies based on dynamics in the larger market. I think there are some commonalities across organizations, in a more restricted labor market. The focus is not so much on attrition. People are staying put because it's more difficult to find employment elsewhere. There's been a lot about like RTO. That's been a hot button issue for a lot of organizations, and
Even the smaller ones. Interesting.
even smaller ones. Yeah, maybe to a lesser extent, but the for all the mandates, there's not really a lot of data to support the benefits of returning to the office, right? And so, what are the differences in experiences between like remote folks versus like in office folks, or like what's kind of like a pre and post when we see people come to the office? What are people saying? And there's like the kind of the anecdotes of like maybe people aren't happy about it, but like, do we actually have data that suggests that this is a real problem? Like people are leaving the company because of this and because of, more friction in their commute or whatever it might be. And so I think that's one that's, it's top of mind right now. I think one thing though that is always top of mind is like manager effectiveness. Right. And probably even more so right now. It's like, what is the role of leaders in an organization and how is that evolving? And I think, our take at OrgAcuity is while there's a formal reporting structure in every organization in terms of like who reports to who's facilitating the performance reviews and whatnot, there's also, whether you call it like a guild or a squad or there's kind of this horizontal construct that is their closest collaborators. Like, how is work actually happening in organizations? How does work actually get done? And that's often very different from the official formal organizational hierarchy. And
Right.
so, we look at both. We look at it both ways. But I think, listening platforms for a long time have been very, I would say, individually focused. That the variables are very individually focused, and that like what are the individual perceptions about their manager or about their career or about their job, and those are important to be clear. But if we're going to really elevate the predictive power and our ability to understand why things happen in organizations, it's not just individual factors, right? There's team level factors, and by team level factors, I'm not just talking about the formal structure, but like their actual work group, that the people that they surround themselves with, how does that influence how they experience life in the organization and their intentions to stay or to contribute, extra effort. And that's kind of the unique lens that we're applying to it.
What do you mean? Like, you think about like how many teams? I don't know. I'm probably on like 7 teams right now, right? And each one has a little bit of a different feel. It's called an organization for a reason, as opposed to like just like an individual, contributor. But you're right. We do think about it that way, and especially in the smaller organizations, it's going to be easier to actually tease this out, or actually more interesting, because the power dynamics become much more salient. Like, I don't know, like the CEO's son is now the head finance officer. We know what that means, these sort of things. Or people just do have different sort of roles that they play, and it's just much easier to tease out, but much more impactful too, because people need to navigate that in these sort of smaller, mid-sized organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we find is when you integrate kind of information about one's network, who are the person's closest collaborators, when you integrate the listening side about those collaborators,
Oh yeah.
like what's their on average, what's their engagement level or their intentions to stay, or the satisfaction with their manager, when you integrate that, that becomes far more important in understanding like an individual's intentions within their formal work group, because they're influenced by the perception, like it's the contagion effect, right? They're influenced by the intentions and the experiences of those with whom they are working most closely.
It's so easy to just like think like, oh, Craig scored a 4 on this item, and Scott scored a 3. Therefore, Scott's worse off. But I mean, when you do look at the broader network, you start understanding like why this sort of happens, and then you can start like solutioning for a actual outcome that you can want to influence.
Yeah. And this is fascinating. I was so happy that you guys would get to geek out on some of the O&A stuff here. I am curious, Craig, what role does AI play in your platform? And I'm sure you're getting this question all the time. And how are you guys tackling it? Have you integrated it? And how does that make a difference for your customers?
Yeah, it's certainly a game changer in many ways. I mean, we are, we're not quick to embed AI into like every aspect of our platform. We want to do it very intentionally and very responsibly. But one of the big challenges that organizations have is, we surface all of this insight, and then managers get busy with their day to day, and they don't, communicate back to their team what they heard and what they plan to do, because they probably don't feel confident in like representing, that the major insights or explaining the methodology, and so they just don't say anything.
Yeah.
And then one of these surveys rolls around again, and teams don't participate because they said, well, we participated last time and no one even shared what the results were, much less took like action and changed what's going wrong in the organization. And so one thing that we're doing with AI is generating conversational talking points for managers based on the specific results of their team. And so like literally it removes the excuse for not communicating the results, because they can just read these Gen AI summaries of the results. It's very conversational, very informal language. And so that kind of checks the box on like closing the loop and communicating what they heard. The next piece is, suggested actions. I try not to get on my soapbox here, but there's always an action planning module in these platforms. And of the 7 companies at which I've led people analytics and employee listening, I've never once seen the action planning module of one of these listening platforms used. And it's because people don't want to self-report progress throughout the year in a platform that they really don't need to be in, because it doesn't have anything to do with their day-to-day, tasks and operations. And so there's been many approaches to this, like from nudges, which I think end up being more like noise in their inbox, just like extra emails or extra Slacks or extra whatever it is. I like the idea in theory, but I think in practice it's very difficult. But nevertheless, like the ultimate goal of what we do, I think this is true for OrgAcuity. I think it's true just like in general for people analytics practitioners, is behavioral change, right? If there's no change that comes from the insight, that it was just like an intellectual academic exercise. And that's really unfortunate, because, done correctly, if we think about the change management up front and like who do we need to, bring to bear on this project to really drive change at scale and like make sure that they're educated on the insights and what they suggest and what they don't suggest, I think behavioral change is possible. And so, our platform does leverage AI to suggest actions to every manager based on the unique opportunities within their team. We use AI to, summarize, copious amounts of open-ended text, from comments that most managers are not going to read, but this will give them kind of the TLDR of these are the strengths and opportunities that emerge from your thousands and thousands of employee comments. Here's the relative sentiment. Here's the key topics. We've got a topic taxonomy that we're using to tag those comments too. So there's just a lot of ways that we can use AI responsibly to make the insights more accessible and to increase the likelihood that first they'll communicate the results, then action will be taken, and then behavioral change will follow.
Well, the whole goal of what we do is just to improve decision-making quality, right? And like decision-making to an action, to your point. And I mean, like even in large organizations, managers don't fully understand what they're looking at when they're looking at, results of a, sophisticated analysis. And just being able to have an AI agent there to explain that away. Is like we're entering a fantastic future in this sort of way. Absolutely. But also being able to summarize the comments, right? There's only so much you can do with quantitative data, but the qualitative aspect is unreal as well.
Yeah, and it's so important for contextualizing the results, right? The quantitative will say what,
Oh yeah.
often, but the why, it's like you really need a deeper understanding of the qualitative results. But, managers are busy, right? In every organization, they're busy. And so we're always thinking about how do we remove the friction and how do we make it easier for people, whether that's through a delightful user experience. The UI needs to be simple. It needs to be clean. It needs to be inviting and engaging, but also the way in which we serve up the insights and support organizations. It needs to meet them where they are and just remove the barriers to taking action.
And then you match that with the active O&A process, right? You can actually see where like these sort of things are emanating, and you get these sort of like layers of like why things occur. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that one's been really fun to explore. I think active and passive both have their place. They're both important. What we find is that in some organizations, passive is challenging. It's a challenging
Oh yeah.
sell because there's the technical requirements to implement connectors with productivity tools, and that requires IT support, which sometimes HR doesn't have. But also, I think fundamentally, it's the optics of like this is like spyware or Big Brother, and like
Yeah.
my every action, my every move is being watched and monitored, and so we don't play in the passive space. The active, it has a ton of value, and it's typically much easier to implement because it's an opt out versus an opt in. So if one doesn't feel comfortable, right, they just don't.
It's more pointed as well, right? Like you can ask very specific questions, especially in a smaller organization, that get to the heart of the issue. 100% makes way more sense.
Yeah, and the archetypes we define they're very customizable. Obviously, we've got a set of delivered questions that they can start with of like, your advisors or your subject matter experts or your career coachers. But, they can bring different archetypes to the table based on whatever change initiative they're wanting to drive and what they're wanting to understand. And so, in addition to that, we're also using like some different algorithms to understand like the nature of one's influence. And so, for example, like we have something called an information broker, which we're using like betweenness centrality for right? It's like we're not asking a question about that, but we're inferring it based on observing the person's place in the network and the nature of their, connections. So there's a lot of interesting, insight that we can glean from that.
You're talking my love language now.
Well, Craig, you mentioned it briefly earlier, but I think you had a case study with one of your larger clients in terms of like how could you bring about business impact and tying traditional HR data to business metrics and driving value. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've shared this story many times about my first experience in people analytics, which was when I took ownership of employee listening from that compliance function. My first meeting with the executive team, it was very clear to me that engagement was like this fluffy construct that they really did not care about. Like we started talking about it, and people were multitasking, checking their phones. Like it was clear like they did not take it seriously, and so I knew then that unless I was going to connect this with something that they cared about, this was going to be a waste of time to keep coming back and talking about employee engagement. So I think it's like a concept that like we all like intrinsically think is something good, right? Like we want people to care and be committed and to like really give, go above and beyond the call of duty to influence outcomes. But like we've got to prove it in that specific organization for a lot of leaders to take it seriously. It's not good enough to just consult the academic literature. And so, what we do for organizations in this case study that you're referencing, Cole, this was a large insurance company, and the majority of the company were insurance agents. And so these were people that were out in the field, that were writing contracts, bringing in deals. They were the folks like bringing in the money. And so it was very important to understand, how can we influence their success in a favorable direction? And so, rather than coming in and talking about like our insurance agent population is like highly engaged or highly disengaged or moderately engaged, what we enabled them to do through the OrgAcuity platform is connect the dots with all the quantifiable performance measures that they had and provided to us. And there were dozens of performance metrics on every insurance agent. And so, that allowed them to elevate the conversation from one about engagement to one about here's the characteristics of a highly engaged insurance agent in terms of like how many more, for every 1% increase in employee engagement, here's the average number of additional contracts they're writing per month. And here's what that translates to in terms of, business impact and real revenue growth. And they shared like that was an absolute game changer. They had never had that insight. They didn't have a platform previously that brought those things together. It's like they had like survey data over here and business data over here and didn't have a budget for kind of like a multi-source data integrator. So nothing happened. They just kind of sat in silos. And so by bringing that together, it really informed the way that they were able to go request additional funding for people initiatives. Because if they want to improve these business outcomes, we see the levers that we can pull to really do that. And there's some, associated investment requirements to do that at a more scalable level to increase engagement and other aspects of their experience.
I mean, that's the name of the game, the business impact. Like, is that like table stakes? Like when you like meet with these companies, like we need some sort of performance outcome data. If you want to increase performance, we need some sort of access to your systems.
Yeah, it really depends, and so the I think the challenging thing with business data is that it's not owned by HR.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So it really depends on, yeah. So like we can't fully solve that. Like we can make it easy to integrate the data in our platform to the extent they can serve it to us. But if the, the relationship between like, business intelligence team or business analytics team and HR is not, favorable, or if they don't really have a partnership, it becomes difficult to get that data. And so, the nice thing about going down market and working with smaller organizations is that there tend to be less silos. That tends to be easier. And in some cases, many cases, there's no people analytics team. Like our solution, our platform is that capability for them. They just have a centralized like analytics COE, in which case they've got all the data. And so, but I think as you go up market, as you go to larger organizations, it gets increasingly more difficult to get access to that data because it becomes more and more siloed.
Well, the larger organizations have more diversified sort of outcomes they're trying to achieve. Like if you're dealing with like a small, I don't know, I hate to put a number on it, maybe 30-person sales sort of small company, they have one mission, right? It makes it very straightforward, like what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been our experience too. Yep.
Well, Craig, was there anything you wanted to geek out with Scott on in terms of the O&A stuff? I think you were listening to one of our recent podcasts.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, thank you guys for what you do. This podcast is such a contribution to the PA community. Yeah, such diversity of conversation too. Like this is just such an important resource. One of the recent podcasts that I was listening to was with Mark Huslett and Alec Levinson. And you guys were talking a lot about explaining variance and different outcomes. And I really enjoyed that conversation. And it got me thinking about, this idea of like active O&A and how could that contribute to this effort in explaining more variance in an outcome? Again, like looking at more like work group level variables versus like individually focused variables. And so just kind of curious, like if you had any thoughts or ideas about, the extent to which this would be helpful in that endeavor.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's such a large question. Like at a broad level, most companies they are still network analytics is still sort of like nascent in a lot of ways, because I think it's like a little bit unwieldy. It's less direct in like how you're supposed to use it. There's not as much direction on how it should be used. But with that said, it provides an orthogonal view of the organization. Orthogonal to like you referenced earlier, you started out with just like people data, tenure, level, all this sort of stuff. Hard to find a difference. You layer in some employee sentiment data. You got like another sort of aspect to the employee experience. Now you level in how they actually communicate, right? And now you got like a sort of different angle. But I think it all goes back to essentially job analysis. What do you need to perform the role appropriately? And the social aspect in an organization is critical at almost every level. And it varies. Obviously, the higher you go up, the more influence you need to wield. But it needs to be at every single level to understand the employee experience. Definitely.
Yeah, I think that notion of like social capital, we talk a lot about human capital, but the relational capital, the social capital, I feel like these are dynamics and factors that are largely missing from many models and from, our efforts to understand variance and different outcomes.
I mean, you look at just like the senior leader network, like their performance is directly related to their ability to make connections to other senior leaders, right? And if you go all the way to the bottom of the organization, say small work groups or say like highly technical folks, they tend to work in very sort of siloed organizations. They don't talk to anybody outside their team. And the way I like to put it is imagine driving from, California to Florida with, your significant other. It's like around Alabama, you're gonna break down and be like, you can't tell me anything else. I gotta get out of this car. And I think
Alabama. I mean, I'm thinking like
you think Oklahoma, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, Nevada, maybe.
But from everyone understands network analytics at a basic level. And I think that we confuse it in a lot of the jargon that we use around it. Like the one example I like to use is just think about a high school cafeteria. You got like the jocks table, you got the popular kids table, you got I don't know, the weirdos table, the band nerds, all this sort of stuff. And, there's different dynamics that take place and how they interact within themselves, across themselves. And you can start thinking about if you're at a wallflower, what does that mean for your experience? If you're at the very center, what does that mean? Are you a big fish in a little pond? Are you a big fish overall? And what does that mean overall?
Yeah, and are you the person that's connecting all of these?
Yeah.
Right, like you're like you gel with all of them. You've got like favorable relationships with all of them, and like what does that mean for your influence and impact?
That was the kid that sold weed in my high school. You knew everybody.
Uh, oh my gosh. Well, Craig, I got one last question for you. I don't understand how you do it all. And so when in prepping for this, you're like, I work from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. every day. And I'm like, how do you have a hobby? Like, what do you do?
What do you do for fun, Craig? I think that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, as it turns out, and I'm very thankful to have found this, as it turns out, my, what I get paid to do and what I love to do are one and the same. Like I love this field of people analytics and employee listening. I think it's work that really does matter. It impacts real people and real organizations. And I've seen it time and time again. Again, I like harken back to those like less favorable experiences that I had early in my career where maybe it was like a manager who was newly promoted that just didn't have any business managing people, or they weren't given the tools and the training and support to learn how to be a good people manager, but they were, maybe making life not so favorable for many people on the team. And so I love to help people thrive and work in life. Like fundamentally, I really, really enjoy that. I wish I had more hours in the day to do that. Got a lot of people reaching out about, I want to get into people analytics. How do I do that? And like I try to respond to as many people as I can and help them navigate career pathways in the space, because I think it's work that really matters. And I think part of the reason that I've worked at so many organizations is because it took me a while to figure this out about myself. But I think at heart I am an entrepreneur. So I've been an entrepreneur for a while. I've been building new capabilities and established companies. But I want to do that at scale. Like I love to do it for one organization, but even better when I can help many organizations gain access to what I found to be so important to individual and organizational success. And so, yes, I work a lot of hours, and at times that can that can take its toll. But it's work that I really am passionate about. It's work that I really care about. It's work that I know people and organizations need, and I want to make it more available and more accessible.
That's super admirable and a lofty goal that hopefully everyone can achieve eventually, right? Hopefully the power of AI will help us all enjoy our jobs and not just see it as another task.
Yeah. Well, Craig, you've been fantastic, man. It's been so cool to see your evolution and learn more about OrgAcuity. Before I give you the final word, any parting words for him, Scott?
Craig, man, it's great to see you again. Love the attitude. I love what you're doing because this sort of insights are needed across the board. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, guys, for all you do. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. Really have enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, if people want to learn more, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn or check out the website, orgacuity.com. And we would love to help more organizations gain access to these capabilities.
Yeah. You guys all go check out OrgAcuity. Fantastic company. And thanks so much again, Craig. You've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Craig Starbuck, on our HR Tech Voices series, CEO of OrgAcuity. Thanks for joining us, Craig.
Thanks for having me.